Hello and welcome to Trusts and Estates Weekly. I had to take a beat there to remember which show I'm doing. It's Monday and it's 10 a.m. here on the West Coast and 1 p.m. on the East Coast. And it's 11 a.m. and 12 noon at Mountain and Central Time. And we are here every week to talk about issues related to estate planning and the management of trusts and estates, dealing with wills, and all of those topics, both from a personal financial planning standpoint and from the view of professionals who are either involved in these areas already or are considering getting involved in them in order to expand their practices and help more people. So today we're going to talk about which is the right estate planning device for you, a will or a trust. And I'm going to go ahead and jump right into things. Here we go. And slideshow, there it is. Okay. and here's our handy dandy PowerPoint and for Trust and Estates Weekly. And we'll go ahead here. Of course, the 3 pillars of fitness. For those of you who are longtime viewers of the show, you're familiar with this. For those of you who are new to the show, so this is a way of organizing our lives to do our best to make sure we're paying attention to the various aspects that we need to deal with. Okay, so will versus trust, choosing the right estate planning tool for you. So I'm going to go through, I believe it's 6 issues to consider, okay, and talk about each one at least a little bit, so you can get an idea of what are the kind of things you need to think about, and more importantly, discuss with the people who are giving you advice, or if you're an advisor, the issues that you need to discuss with your clients. So, as always, this is not intended to be direct advice for you. This is to give you some information so that you can deal with the professionals, your lawyer, your accountant, if you have a professional fiduciary you're working with, to make a more informed decision working with them. Now, let me say that for most people who have significant assets, they are probably going to have both of these, both a will and a trust. I know I do, for example, and that's because they have different purposes. They work in a different way. And if you're unfamiliar with that, I invite you to go to our YouTube channel and look at some past episodes where I've talked about how trusts work, how a will works, what probate is, okay? And that will give you some idea of what these 2 tools do, okay? And we're going to cover a little bit about that in this episode, but we're not going to get into a real deep dive into the differences between a will and a trust, more the issues that you're going to want to think about as you decide which is going to be your primary vehicle, okay? Now, the reality is, if a will is going to be your vehicle, then you probably are not going to have a trust, okay? At least not for yourself. Now, you may set up a separate trust, as we'll talk about in a minute. However, if you have a trust, you may still have a will in order that certain other property that for one reason or another doesn't go into your trust will still be designated for the beneficiaries that you want. Okay, so excuse me. All right, let's talk. I'm going to talk about, first of all, kind of 3 issues that are sort of personal issues, as opposed to the second group, which are more financial issues. Okay, so oh, and here we have someone joining in. Hey, Dale. Oops, here we go. Okay, so the first thing you want to look at is your age and health. Okay, so if you are young, if you're healthy, the urgency of and by the way, and perhaps don't have a lot of assets. So there's not a lot of urgency necessarily in your estate planning. Okay. Now, of course, any one of us can pass away at any time. Yes, that's true. But on an odds basis, if you will, younger people are far less likely to die than people who are older. Okay. So my daughter is probably, praise God, as they say, probably going to outlive me. And that's the natural scheme. That's the natural way things are. Okay. So when you're young, don't have a whole lot of assets, you're in good health. So at that time, a will may be all that you need to make sure that whatever amount of property you have will go to your intended heirs. Okay. But as you get older, and especially as your health declines, where the possibility of passing away becomes greater. So then at that point, a trust may be a better vehicle. And the reason is because by doing a trust, you are effectively setting up the transfer mechanism for your property while you're still alive. Okay. Keep in mind that a will does not go into effect until you die. Okay. And the person you appoint as your executor, or that the court appoints as your administrator, that person is going to have the responsibility to see that your wishes are carried out. Now, hopefully you'll choose someone that's going to do that in accordance with really what you want to have happen. But if there's any ambiguities in the will, so now because you've already died, your executor is going to have to do the best he can to resolve those ambiguities according to what he thinks you would have wanted. With a trust, all of that gets worked out while you're alive. Okay. And so that's one of the important reasons, I should say, for setting up a trust is a lot of the details of not only the estate planning, but almost the transference takes place while you're alive. Now, you retain control of the asset. So I'm not saying it literally goes to other people. However, as part of setting up your trust, you may decide to go ahead and transfer certain assets to other people, okay, in advance. Okay, I know, my mother did that. And like over the last year or two, she's been going through, in her case, her personal property, and she's been distributing it out to my sisters and me, and I don't know, whoever else she's distributing it to. I don't know. I know I got some books that she's had for literally decades. They're beautiful, beautiful copies of classic books. And, she knew that I would appreciate them. And so as part of her, revising her trust, she went ahead and made some of those distributions so she could make sure they went where she wanted them to go. Okay, so as the likelihood of our dying gets closer, so then we probably want to look more closely at perhaps creating a trust, especially if we have significant property, which is something I'll touch on in the next group of issues. Okay, marital status. Now, if we're single, okay, then having a will may be all that's necessary. Okay, again, we'll get to some of the financial issues later. But if we're married, okay, wills just become more complex. So Are we going to have a situation where, depending on which spouse dies first, the will is going to transfer one spouse's property to the other, and then that spouse will do another will distributing the property to their heirs? Okay, is that the way they're going to do it? Now, if the spouses had children before let's say they were married before and now they're remarried, so they have children by their first marriages, how is that going to work? Right? Is that going to cause bad feelings between the surviving spouse and the children from the prior marriage? Okay, that's another issue. A second or a third issue, I should say, is, are the husband and wife going to do a joint, essentially a joint will, or are they going to do separate wills? Okay, so already you can see there's complexity that comes into even something as simple as a will, just by virtue of the marital status of the people involved. Okay, and at that point where you're dealing with all these complexities for a will, it might make more sense at that point to then just go ahead and do a trust, because again, your wishes can be worked out while both spouses are alive, and then the mechanisms of what's going to happen when the first spouse dies can be built in, and then when the second spouse dies, that can also be built in. Okay, certain provisions can be set up in a way that they cannot be changed, and in fact you could do a will that once it's set up, I'm sorry, not a will, you could do a trust that once it's set up, the terms of it cannot be changed. Now, again, these are all questions you're going to want to talk to your advisors about before making any decisions. There are pluses and minuses to all of these, and your specific circumstances need to be looked at before you decide which way to go. However, the main point here is, when you're married, that adds a level of complexity to your estate planning, okay, that needs to be addressed, and especially if there are children and children from a prior marriage involved, even more complexity. Okay, the third sort of personal issue is if you have special needs beneficiaries. Okay, so let's say you have a neurodiverse child. And then the child, by the way, may even be an adult. Okay, a neurodiverse includes people on the autism spectrum, people with Down syndrome. So it used to be that people with not so much autism, but even Down syndrome and some other conditions didn't live very long. Now medical technology has advanced tremendously, and a lot of folks live much longer lives, and they can live very productive lives, right? In fact, I work with the neurodiverse through an organization, and our mandate is we want to help them to live as wonderful lives as possible, productive lives, right? Nonetheless, for a neurodiverse child, let alone a neurodiverse adult, a lot of times they can live relatively independently, but they do need some support. Okay, and so as part of your estate planning, you may want to make sure that the funds are there to take care of that child, even if the child is an adult, through the rest of the child's life. So you don't, after you're gone, you don't have to worry, gosh, is my child going to end up on the street, or are they going to lose their whatever it is, twice a week person who comes in and helps them, or whatever the level of support services are. Okay, now one of the ways to do that it would be to make a bequest to them through a will, and that transfers money to them. Okay, but they may not be really able to handle their own finances, and so then what's going to happen if all of a sudden there's this lump sum of money there to help them, but how is it going to actually get set up to help them? Okay, and so in that case, again, it may be better, even though it'll be more work and more costly up front, to go ahead and set up what's called a special needs trust. Okay, and then you can appoint a trustee to that trust who can make sure that the goals of the trust are fulfilled even after you pass away. And if you do this while you're still alive, you can monitor what the trustee is doing, okay, and see, wow, is that trustee really taking care of things properly? And frankly, if they're not, as a trustor, you may be able to reserve the right to replace that trustee if they're not doing a proper job, right, while you're still alive. That's one of the big benefits, okay? So, in fact, I have a situation right now where someone set up a special needs trust, and the trustee is draining money from the trust, and we're trying to find out where is that money going, because from what the person is saying about how much of it is going to the beneficiary of the trust, the numbers don't add up. It appears that more than twice the money that the person is saying has been spent on the beneficiary has been taken out of the trust. So the concern is that the trustee has taken money for the trustee's benefit, not for the beneficiary's benefit, right? In this case, the trustor has died, but nonetheless, this is something that can be submitted for court review. And if the court sees that the trustee has breached the trustee's fiduciary obligation, so then the court can relieve that trustee of the trustee's responsibility and appoint someone else instead, and that trustee then would have basically two responsibilities. One would be to continue the management of the trust solely for the benefit of the beneficiary, but then also to do what can be done to recover the money that was taken that should not have been taken. Okay, so again, you can see once complexity comes in, then the consideration of using a trust as an estate planning tool becomes more important. Okay, all right, so those are the three what I call personal issues. Let's move on to now more of the financial issues. Okay, so again, which is better, a will or a trust, based on these more sort of financial, and you might call them legal issues too. Okay, so number one is, what is the size of the estate that you're dealing with? Okay, if you have, a car and maybe, a bank account and maybe a retirement account, and there's, $30,000, $40,000 in the retirement account. So a trust may not make sense because it does cost more to create a trust, and also to transfer all the assets and all of that, especially if you can't do it yourself. And because there are other ways to transfer assets. So here in California, a car can, if a car is going to be passed to a spouse, it doesn't have to go through probate. Okay, you can just go down to the DMV, show a copy of the death certificate, and fill out the paperwork, and the car will be transferred. And I believe that's also true from a parent to a child. Okay, now these rules may vary from state to state. So just because California allows something doesn't mean any of the other 49 states do. Of course, that's something to check out. But in that case, you don't even need a will to transfer that asset. Okay, and bank accounts sometimes can be set up so with someone designated to receive the account upon death of the account holder. So again, you don't even need a will in that case. Okay, and then for whatever other assets there may be, a will may be perfectly fine for seeing to it that whatever personal property is left is distributed according to your wishes. Okay, and in fact, my newsletter that went out this morning, I talked about this issue of how do we ensure that our heirlooms and personal property go to their intended beneficiaries? This is a oft-time overlooked aspect of estate planning. People think about real estate, they think about, brokerage accounts, bank accounts, that kind of stuff. And they forget that oftentimes we have, well, okay, so for example, I mentioned a few minutes ago, the books that my mother had. So both my younger sister and I are bibliophiles. And I could imagine that, I don't think there would have been, but two bibliophiles, we both want these books that my mother has had for a good part of her life, right? It's a potential grounds for dispute. So by handling it up front, my mother, got rid of any potential conflict there. And so your will, if you have a small estate, the will may essentially just be a list of, my diamond engagement ring with the white gold setting and the pear-shaped diamond. This I want to go to this specific person, and make a very detailed list in your will, and so that way the executor knows exactly what goes to whom, and there's little if any room for conflict to arise. Okay, as an estate gets larger, okay, the desirability of using a trust becomes greater. So, a rule of thumb, and again, this is a rule of thumb, doesn't apply to everybody necessarily, but a rule of thumb here in California is if you own a house, you should have a trust, because you probably have sufficient equity in that house that having to go through probate will become, work, and it will become cost. Whereas if you set up the trust and spend the money to do that, sometimes as little as maybe just a couple $1,000s to maybe $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, you can avoid all the cost and hassle of going through probate, number one. And number two, if you have a sizable estate, especially if you have multiple beneficiaries, so then the trust will allow you, as we said before, to set things up while you're alive. And again, you will avoid potential conflict. And when there's a large estate, that increases the potential for conflict because there's more to fight over. And there's a tendency to think, no, my heirs are not going to fight over stuff. They all love each other. They're all giving people. Yeah, I don't mean to disparage, your relatives or whatever, but sometimes once the parent is gone or the person who owned the property is gone, the gloves come off. And those fights can get very nasty and very costly. Okay, so a lot of estate planning, from my perspective, a lot of estate planning revolves around doing our best to not let disputes arise. Okay, all right, we're looking at time here. Okay, we're good. All right, so second on the list of financial/legal issues is avoiding probate. So a will has to go through probate as far as I know, all jurisdictions. Okay, certainly here in California, and in Alabama as well. So probate can be time consuming, as I said before. It can be costly, and it also time consuming in the sense it takes a lot of time to do the work, but also it can be a lengthy process, and so it can delay the time when your beneficiaries will get whatever assets you want transferred to them. And so again, as I mentioned a minute ago, as the size of your estate increases, probably the anxiousness of your heirs to receive that property will also increase. And so the desirability of avoiding probate increases. And you probably want to give greater thought to, do I want to form a trust? So one of the big benefits of a trust is you can avoid probate, or at least with most assets, the assets, I should say, with the assets in the trust, you can avoid probate. Okay. Now, you may not be able to avoid probate all overall. I had a situation where, despite there being a trust and all the assets were transferred to it, there were a few assets that weren't for various reasons. And in the end, because of how the whole situation shaped up, we did end up having to file a probate, but we only had to probate, I think it was 3 pieces of property, as opposed to, what would have been something like 12 or 15 or whatever the total number of accounts and such was. Okay, so avoiding probate, and again, if you want to know more about that, I invite you to go to my YouTube channel, check out the episode on trusts that explain the benefits of trusts, and that's one of the big ones. Okay, and the third financial/legal issue is using a trust may help you reduce estate taxes. Okay, so for most of us, especially right now, our estates are not big enough to be subject to estate taxes. And I did a show on this not too long ago. I think an estate has to be over, I believe it's $12.6 million before it's subject to estate taxes. But that limit drops at the end of next year. Okay, and I think it drops down to $3 or $4 million if memory serves. And so, assuming for the moment that the exemption does not get extended, many more people will find themselves paying estate taxes than has been the case for quite some time now. Okay, and given how much the stock market has gone up over the years, even though it's kind of wavered over the last couple of years, still overall the market has been way up. Real estate values have gone way up, even values of homes much higher now than they were a few years ago. So there's a lot more people who might have an estate with an overall value of $3 or $4 million than there were even a few years ago. And by the way, that's the gross value of the estate, meaning if you have a house that's worth, let's say, $1 million, but you have a $600,000 mortgage against it, for estate tax purposes, they're not looking at the equity of $400,000. They're looking at the gross value of the house, the $1 million. Okay, so this is a crucial issue for you to discuss with your advisors if you have any kind of substantial assets at all, especially in light of the upcoming change that's occurring with estate taxes. And if you, again, want to know more details on that, I did a show on gift and estate taxes a few weeks ago, and there I give you what the hard numbers currently are and what the dates are. I don't remember exactly what they are off the top of my head at the moment, but you want to research that and be very, very diligent about dealing with that and getting good advice. Okay, estate tax rates are higher than income tax rates. Okay, and so they could substantially reduce what's available to go to your beneficiaries if your estate tax planning is not done well. Okay, so that's the third of the sort of financial legal issues. And that's the show for today. So if you want any help, you have any questions, you can see here on the screen where to get them. This information will be in the show notes as well. Feel free to send me an email, or if it's if it's something personal, but if it's a sort of a more general question that other people may benefit from knowing the answer, hey, just drop it into one of our social media sites, and I will respond to it. Or if I don't know the answer, I will get someone who's an expert in that area to respond and help you sort of clarify the picture for yourself. Okay, and here's all the legal stuff. Of course, going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And you can see my buddy Dell here. We've been friends since college, so for many years. It's nice to have you join me, Dell. Thanks for coming on onto the meeting. So that's what I've got for you today. I hope you found this useful. I spoke primarily from the standpoint of someone who's doing their estate plan, but of course, if you are someone who helps people with estate planning, so these are the kinds of issues that you're going to want to look at. I did not give a comprehensive list. There's simply not enough time to do that, number one. And number two, a comprehensive list will be different for each individual. So what I did is I highlight the 6 most common issues that come up in deciding which estate planning tool to use. And so as advisors, we need to keep in mind that we need to ask the questions of our clients that apply to their situation and really, dig as deeply as possible to make sure that we serve them well. Okay, so like I said, that's the show for today on Trust and Estates Weekly. Join me tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific time for my show, Business Lessons from the Military. We'll be continuing our discussion of Marine Corps warfighting doctrine. We're talking about the translation of that doctrine into how we run our businesses. And I think you will find, especially if you are in your own business, you'll find that useful. But if you're working for someone else too, I think you'll find these lessons very worthwhile. And then on Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And I'm going to take you through a simple process for eliminating your debts. So, a lot of people carry debt, unfortunately, especially credit card debt. And there are simple, effective ways to deal with it and get out of it. I know I went through the process myself when I was a younger man. I had a lot of debt from starting my first couple of businesses. And by the time I joined the Navy, I was essentially out of debt. So I'm going to take you through this step by step. And I think you will find that very, very useful. And again, if you are advising people, I think you will find this useful as well, even though it may not apply to you personally. So thanks for tuning in, and I appreciate it. If you're not a subscriber to our YouTube channel, please do consider subscribing. That way you'll get notified each time there's a new episode. And that way you'll never miss the kind of the information that we're generating. You'll never miss any of the interviews we do with what is shameless plugging, I guess, right? The interesting guests that I'm able to bring on the show. So wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow and Wednesday. Signing off, Marie, darling, you are my belle. All the best, folks.